Mrs. Aldred, would you mind telling me what exactly you plan to do with 40 pounds of rye seed in the middle of July? The man asking was Clement Ozer, who ran the co-op out on Route 9 and had a habit of asking questions the way a doctor delivers bad news. Quietly, but certain he already knew the answer. He stood at the counter with his reading glasses pushed up in his forehead and looked at Nadine Aldred the way most of Harlan County looked at her that summer of 1981. Like she had said something in a language nobody recognized. Nadine didn't look up from her purse right away. She counted out the bills slowly, the way her mother had taught her, always knowing exactly what you had before you handed any of it away. I plan to plant it, she said. Clement waited. When nothing else came, he said, In August. That's right. He set the seed invoice down on the counter and scratched the back of his neck. Behind him, two men who'd been looking at bolt bins pretended to keep looking at bolt bins. Nadine, he said, dropping the misses, which meant he was about to say something he considered kind. The ground's baked hard as a sidewalk out there. Rye in August on clay soil. You'll get nothing. You know that. She picked up her receipt, folded it once, and tucked it into the same pocket where she kept her list. Thank you, Clement, she said. I'll let you know how it goes. She walked out into the heat, and nobody laughed. Not that day. The laughter came later, slow and certain as a crop coming in, starting that fall when the rye actually germinated, and people realized she'd done it on purpose, and then building through the following years, as she kept doing it, kept seeding cover crops into fields that the rest of Harlan County left bare from August through March, kept talking about nitrogen and soil biology at the co-op meetings, where the other farmers nodded politely, and then went home and told their wives what Nadine Aldred was up to now. This is a story about a woman who was wrong, according to everyone who knew her for almost a decade, and then wasn't. Nadine Aldred had inherited the farm from her father, Gerald Schott, who had worked 212 acres of central Nebraska his entire adult life and died in the spring of 1979 with $34,000 in equipment debt and a piece of ground that had been growing corn and soybeans in alternating years since 1951. Her mother, Ruth, had gone to live with Nadine's sister in Omaha by then, and Nadine's husband, Ray Aldred, had died of a heart attack in 1977 at the age of 44, leaving Nadine with the farm she'd grown up on, a daughter finishing high school, and a grain operation she had been watching her father run for 30 years, but had never been expected to run herself. She was 41 years old. She had a checking account, with enough in it to cover one planting season if nothing went wrong, and a good name at the Farmers and Merchants Bank in Millard, which was the county seat, 15 miles east on a road that turned to gravel for the last 4 of them. The farm itself was what you would have called tired. Gerald Schott had been a careful man, but not an experimental one, and 30 years of corn-soy rotation had done to his topsoil what 30 years of anything done the same way will eventually do. Nadine knew this the way she knew most things about the land, not from books at first, but from watching. She had watched the water run off the fields after rain, carrying topsoil in a thin brown sheet toward the low end of the east quarter. She had watched the way yields had been inching down for years, even in good rain years, even with more fertilizer each time. She had watched her father shake his head at the soil test results and order more nitrogen and plant corn again. After Gerald died, Nadine spent the first season doing what she was supposed to do. She hired Lester Pruitt and his son to help with planting, used the same seed varieties her father had used, applied the same inputs, and came out at the end of 1979 with a crop that would have made her father nod and say it was all right. It was all right. Corn at $2. 28 a bushel and a decent yield, and enough to cover her expenses and make a small payment on the equipment note. She spent that winter reading. She read everything she could find about soil. She sent away for university extension bulletins. She drove to Lincoln twice and spent full days in the agricultural library at the university, where a young graduate student named Thornton. She never got his last name. Noticed what she was pulling from the shelves and started leaving relevant articles on the table where she worked, without saying anything, just setting them down and going back to whatever he was doing. She read about cover crops. She read about Dr. William Albrecht's work on soil mineral balance from the 1940s. She read a translated paper from a German agronomist, published in 1962, that described something he called lebendig Erde, living soil, and the difference in how it behaved under drought versus dead, compacted ground. She read it twice. By February of 1980, she had a notebook with 63 pages of handwritten notes, and a plan she hadn't told anyone about yet. She told her daughter, Becca, first. Becca was 19, working at a hardware store in Millard, and saving to take nursing classes in the fall. They were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, the notebook open between them, and Nadine walked her through it. The cover crops, the fall seedings, the plan to reduce tillage gradually over 3 years, the long timeline before any of it would show up in yields. Becca listened the way she always listened, with her chin in her hand, looking at the page, not at her mother. When Nadine finished, Becca said, "How long until you know if it's working?" "Honestly, maybe 5 years before I see it in yields, maybe more." Becca was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you believe it?" Nadine said yes. "Then do it," Becca said, and closed the notebook. And that was that. The first public laugh came in October of 1981. Nadine had seeded winter rye into her cornfield stubble in early August, which was considered by every farmer in Harlan County to be either a mistake or a sign of something going wrong with her thinking. Winter rye was not unknown in Nebraska, but you planted it after harvest in September or October, not in August, and certainly not into standing stubble without a proper tillage pass first. You didn't just drill rye into the mess of a cornfield, except that she did, and it came up. By October it was 6 inches tall and green in a county that was already brown, a field that looked, from the road, like something had gone wrong with the calendar. People slowed down to look at it. Clement Ozer drove out specifically and stood at the fence line for a while, then drove away without stopping. Del Vance, who farmed the ground north of hers and had been farming it for 30 years, pulled over one afternoon when Nadine happened to be walking the field, checking the stand. "What is that?" Del said. "Rye. I can see it's rye. What's it doing there?" "Growing," Nadine said. Del Vance was not a mean man. He was a thorough man who had opinions about the right way to do everything, and he stated them without malice, the way you state a fact about the weather. "You're going to have a hell of a time getting that terminated in the spring," he said. "And what are you putting in after it?" "Corn. Corn." He looked at the field. "Into that mess. I'll terminate it in May. Plant green if I need to." She could see him working through the logic and finding it wanting at every step. He drove away. He told people about it at the elevator that week, not meanly, but the way you tell a story about something that doesn't add up. By December, it had become a running item in the county's unofficial accounting of who was doing what with their ground, the kind of thing that gets mentioned at the implement dealer when things are slow, a small shared comedy. Nadine heard about it secondhand, through Becca. who heard it from a girl she worked with, whose father farmed near the Vance place. Nadine wrote it down in the notebook. Not the laughter. She didn't write that down. She wrote down what she had observed in the field that week, and what the rye stand looked like, and what she expected it to do to the soil biology over winter. She did not explain herself to anyone that first year. She had tried, once, at a co-op meeting in November, mentioning soil organic matter and nitrogen fixation in the context of a broader discussion about input costs, and had watched the room's attention slide away from her, like water off a hard surface. It wasn't hostility. It was simply that what she was describing did not match the shape of what farming was supposed to look like, and the mismatch was enough. She stopped explaining and kept working. The spring of 1982 was hard. She terminated the rye in early May, waited 2 weeks for it to break down, and planted corn into ground that still onto ground, residue matted across it in places, which was not how ground was supposed to look when you put corn into it. The ground was supposed to be clean and worked and dark, the way ground looked when it was ready. Hers looked like something in between, like it hadn't made up its mind. Corn planting in Harlan County was something neighbors tracked the way they tracked each other's church attendance. Not always commented on, but noted. Del Vance planted into clean ground on May 3rd. His neighbor to the east, a younger man named Corbett, who'd bought the Weston place 2 years earlier, planted on May 5th. Nadine planted on May 12th, later than anyone else in the township, into ground that Lester Pruett's son told his father looked like it had been planted into a compost pile. By late June, the corn was even with Del Vance's. By August, Nadine's field had held its color through a 2-week dry stretch that had the rest of the county watching the sky. Her ground had held more moisture. She knew why. She wrote it down. She didn't mention it to anyone. She was waiting. The yields that fall were not dramatically better. They were measurably better. She ran the numbers carefully. But not by enough to say anything about. Not yet. What was better, in ways that didn't show up in bushels per acre, was the soil. She could feel it when she walked it, the way it gave slightly under her feet where it had been hard before, the way water moved differently after the August rains. She dug up a section of the field and looked at the structure of it and wrote 4 pages in the notebook about what she found. By 1984, people had mostly stopped making jokes and settled into something more comfortable, which was simply not thinking about what Nadine Aldred was doing. This was its own kind of dismissal, quieter than laughter, and in some ways harder to sit with. She was 46. Her daughter had finished nursing school and was working at a hospital in Omaha. The farm was hers entirely now, no hired help except at planting and harvest, and she had expanded the cover crop system to all 4 of her fields, rotating through a mix of species she was changing and refining every year. Rye and hairy vetch together 1 year, a mix with radishes, and turnips the next, always reading, always adjusting. The notebook had become 3 notebooks. The drought of 1983 had been instructive. She had come through it better than most in the county, and the evidence was there in the yields and in the soil moisture readings she'd taken obsessively through July and August. But 1983 was a bad enough year county-wide that people had other things to talk about, and the idea that her system might have helped her through it didn't surface anywhere except in her own notebooks and in a single conversation with a man named Preston. She hadn't caught his last name, who worked for the county extension office and had stopped by in September to look at her fields. He had walked the ground with her for 2 hours. He took soil samples and wrote notes in a small spiral pad and asked careful questions about her timing and species mix and termination methods. Before he left, he stood at the edge of the field for a moment and said, "You know, what you're describing has a name now. They're calling it regenerative agriculture." Nadine looked at him. "I know what it is," she said. "I've been reading about it since 1980. I just haven't been calling it anything." He smiled at that, a small, honest smile. He sent her a copy of his soil test results 2 weeks later, with a note that said the organic matter percentage on her ground was 4.1%, compared to the county average of 1.8%. She put the letter in the third notebook. She did not show anyone the letter. The hardest year was 1986. Corn prices had been falling since 1981 and had hit a low in 1986 that people in Harlan County still talked about for years afterward, the way people talk about a flood that changed the shape of the land. $1.50 a bushel. Equipment notes coming due. The same bank that had smiled at her for years called her in for a meeting in February. And she sat across from a man named Everett Holt, who arranged papers on his desk and talked about cash flow projections and asked about her debt-to-asset ratio and said, carefully, looking at his papers, that they might want to talk about options. She drove home in the cold and sat in the kitchen for a long time. She thought about the letter with the soil test results, still in the notebook. She thought about the extension agent, Preston, and the 2 hours they had walked her fields. She thought about the drying agronomist, about the German agronomist and his paper on living soil and the difference it made. And she thought about her father, who had kept doing the same thing for 30 years and left the land more tired than he'd found it. Then she thought about what she had in those fields that nobody else had. She did the math at the kitchen table that night, the same way she always did math, carefully, on paper, starting from what she knew for certain and working outward. Her input costs had dropped every year for 5 years. She was spending less on nitrogen than any farmer in the county because her soil was producing its own. Her herbicide costs were down. Her fuel costs were down because she was doing less tillage. Her yields were not the highest in the county, but they were more consistent than almost anyone else's, and in a drought year, they were the best. She went back to the bank in March and presented Everett Holt with 5 years of her cost per bushel data compared to the county average, which she had reconstructed from extension reports and conversations. Her cost per bushel to produce corn was $1.21. The county average was $1.67. At $1.50 a bushel, she was still making money. Everett Holt looked at the numbers for a long time. "Where did you get this data?" he said. "My notebooks," she said, "and the extension reports. It's all cited." He went quiet again. Then he said, "Nadine, I have to be honest. I've never seen anyone come in here with something like this." "I know," she said. "I know you haven't." He approved her operating line without changes. She drove home in better spirits than she'd had all winter, and that evening she called Becca in Omaha and told her about the meeting. And Becca said, "Did he understand it?" "Eventually," Nadine said. Becca laughed, and, for the first time in a while, Nadine laughed too. It was Del Vance who came to her in the fall of 1988. He had sold his East Quarter in 1987, forced to, though nobody in the county said it quite that way, and he had refinanced twice on the home place and was running on a margin that was not, strictly speaking, a margin at all. He drove over on a Tuesday in October, when she was in the equipment shed going over the combine header, and he stood in the door of the shed with his cap in his hands, the way men of his generation held caps, when they had come to say something they hadn't quite worked out how to say yet. "I heard," he said, "that your cost numbers are different than most." Nadine set down the wrench, "Sit down, Dell," she said, and pointed at the old wooden stool by the workbench. He sat. She made coffee on the little two-burner. She kept in the shed, and they sat together while it was still warm enough to leave the shed door open, and she went through it with him the way she had gone through it for herself. Not the philosophy, not the soil biology she could have talked about for hours, but the numbers, what she spent on nitrogen, what she spent on herbicides, what her fuel bill looked like compared to what it had been in 1980. How yield consistency, over years, was worth more than peak yield in one good year. Del Vance was a man who listened to numbers even when he wouldn't listen to anything else. He sat with the coffee going cold in his hands and listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How come you never said any of this before?" Nadine looked at him. She thought about Clement Ozer and the bolt bins. She thought about the rye field in October 1981, green when everything else was brown, and the way he had driven away without stopping. She thought about every co-op meeting where the room had looked through her. "I did," she said, quietly. "I said it in November of 1981, at the co-op meeting." Del Vance looked out the shed door at the field. He didn't say anything for a long time. "I think," he said finally, "I think I wasn't ready to hear it then." "No," she said. "You weren't. There was nothing sharp in it. Just the fact of it, plain between them, the way a soil test result is plain." He had not been ready. He was ready now. She could work with that. She spent the next 2 hours showing him her notebooks. In the spring of 1989, Del Vance seeded cover crops for the first time. He called her twice with questions during the process, and she talked him through both calls without impatience, because she remembered what it felt like not to know something that seemed obvious once you knew it. He got his termination timing wrong the first year and had a rough stand. He called her about that too. She told him what she would adjust, and he adjusted it, and the second year was better. Word moved the way word moved in Harlan County, which was slowly and through the same channels everything else moved. The elevator, the co-op, the implement dealer, the Methodist church parking lot on Sunday. By 1990, 2 other farmers had come to Nadine with questions. By 1991, there were 4. None of them framed it as asking for her advice exactly. They framed it as stopping by, as happening to mention something, as wondering if she had ever found that when the rye got too thick, it gave her trouble with the planter. But they were there, and she answered them, and the notebooks had become 6 notebooks by then, the early ones worn at the spine. She started leaving extension bulletins at the co-op, not with her name on them, just leaving them on the counter, where Clement Ozer kept the seed catalogs. She didn't know if anyone read them. She left them anyway. The summer of 1993 was the one that changed things for good, not just in Harlan County, but across the Midwest, because the floods that summer were historic. The Missouri and Mississippi systems went biblical, and while Harlan County was not in the flood zone directly, the rain events that fed the flooding came through the county in June and July, and the county's clay-heavy soils, hard from years of tillage compaction, shed water the way a parking lot sheds water, runoff running to the road ditches, topsoil moving with it, fields standing in water for days after each event. Nadine's fields drained, not perfectly, not immediately, but the infiltration rate on her ground was measurably different from the surrounding fields, and anyone driving down her road could see it within 24 hours of a rain event. The water moved into her soil. It stood in the road ditch and in Del Vance's east quarter and in Corbett's low ground, but on her fields, by the following morning, it was largely gone. The county extension office sent a soil scientist out that August His name was Dr. Raymond Fisk, and he was not from Nebraska. Nebraska? He was from a university in Minnesota and had the slightly bewildered look of someone dropped into a landscape he'd read about but not seen. He spent 2 days on her farm, taking cores and measurements and photographs, and on the second evening he sat with her on the porch and said, "Ms. Aldred, I need to ask you something directly." "All right," she said. "How long have you been doing this?" 12 years, she said. "Since 1981. He looked at his notes. "You started in 1981, August of 1981. I seeded winter rye into corn stubble on the East Quarter. Clement Ozer at the co-op tried to talk me out of it." Dr. Fisk wrote something down. Then he looked up and said, "Do you understand that what you have here? The organic matter levels, the infiltration rates, the aggregate stability, this is what most of the research community is trying to get farmers to work toward. And you've been doing it for 12 years, on your own, in the middle of Nebraska." Nadine thought about the German agronomist's paper. She thought about the 63 pages of notes in the first notebook. She thought about her mother's kitchen table, and about her mother's kitchen table, and the winter of 1980, and the cold drive to Lincoln, and the graduate student who left articles out for her without ever saying why. "I had good sources," she said. The article in the Nebraska Farmer ran in the spring of 1994. It was 3 pages, with photographs of her fields and her notebooks, and a sidebar with the soil test data compared to the county average. The headline called her the cover crop pioneer of Harlan County. She was 56 years old. Clement Ozer bought 3 copies of the issue. She found this out from his wife, who mentioned it at the Lutheran church rummage sale, and she stored the information away without making anything of it. The calls started coming from across the state. Farmers she had never met, calling the number in the article, asking questions she had been answering in her notebooks for a decade and a half. She answered all of them. She started a file folder for correspondence that became a drawer in the filing cabinet that became 2 drawers. Becca came home for Thanksgiving that year and sat at the kitchen table, looking through the correspondence drawer, reading letters and postcards from Iowa and Kansas and South Dakota, from farmers who had started the same way she had, with a bad feeling about their soil, and a winter of reading, and had found her name in the article and written to say that she had put a name to something they'd been working toward, without knowing anyone else was working toward it too. "Mom," Becca said, looking up from a letter, "did you know you were doing something important?" Nadine thought about the question seriously, the way she thought about most things. "I knew the soil was important," she said. "I didn't think about whether I was." Clement Ozer retired from the co-op in 1995. There was a small party at the fellowship hall of the Methodist Church, and Nadine went because she'd known Clement for 30 years, and he'd been a decent neighbor and a fair businessman, even when he'd been wrong about her rye. Near the end of the evening, when most people had gotten their cake and moved to the edges of the room, Clement made his way over to where she was standing. He was a big man who had gotten broader across the shoulders in his 60s, and he stood in front of her with his cake plate in one hand and looked at her in a way that told her he had been working up to something. "I want to say something," he said. "All right, Clement. About 1981, when you came in for the rye seed." He paused. "I wasn't kind about it. You weren't unkind," she said. "I was skeptical in front of other people, which isn't fair." He looked at his cake. "And I talked about it, afterward, at the elevator. I'm not proud of that." Nadine looked at him for a moment. Outside, she could hear car doors and someone calling a child's name in the parking lot. "Clement," she said, "you weren't the only one. You were just the first." He nodded slowly. "I should have listened," he said. "I've been thinking about it. 12 years you were doing it before anybody paid attention. And the whole time your ground was telling the story, if we'd just looked." She thought about that for a moment. The ground telling the story. It was a better way to put it than she'd managed herself in 6 notebooks. "It was," she said. "It just took a while for anyone to read it." He nodded again, and they stood together for a moment in the fellowship hall, with the sound of the party around them and the evening light going orange through the high windows. And it was enough. Not everything that had been lost in those years came back in that moment, but something did. Something that had to do with being believed, with being part of the same community and not simply adjacent to it. And she let herself feel it without pushing it away. Del Vance sold his home place in 1997 and moved to town. The night before the auction, he stopped by and sat in her kitchen for an hour without saying much. He looked older than the man who had stood at her fence line in 1981 and told her she'd have a hell of a time with determination. And he was, and so was she, and neither of them said anything about it. When he got up to go, he stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "That East Quarter I sold in 87. If I'd started doing what you were doing in 81, I might have kept it." Nadine looked at the table. It wasn't a question, and it didn't need an answer that was kind or unkind. It just needed to be true. "Maybe," she said. "It's hard to say." Del Vance nodded and put his cap on and went out through the screen door, and she heard his truck start and pull out of the driveway, and she sat at the kitchen table for a long while after that, thinking about ground and time and the things that show themselves slowly if you have the patience to keep watching. By 1998, there were 14 farmers in Harlan County using some form of the system she had been working out since 1980. She knew this because a graduate student from the University of Nebraska had come out to survey cover crop adoption in the county, and had told her the number, and had also told her, without being asked, that 3 of those 14 had specifically cited talking to her as the reason they'd started. She wrote that down in the 8th notebook. Not because she needed it, but because the ground had taught her that the most important things were always the ones nobody else could see yet, and the only way to trust your shelf-delve through the years when they couldn't see it was to keep titched, was to keep the record, keep watching, keep your own count of what was true. Outside, the fall fields were green with rye again, the way they'd been every October since 1981, green when everything else went brown. The same color they'd been when people drove slowly past and wondered what on earth she thought she was doing. She had known what she was doing. She had just needed the years to prove it.